It's another day in America. Another day in America. Welcome to the America at 250 podcast, devoted to enabling us to see and feel America through the eyes and hearts of others, and as a result, take concrete steps to make America truly great. I'm Kevin Caldwell. And in order to pursue the purpose of this podcast, throughout the project, I'll be inviting a very diverse set of guests to share how they would answer what would make America great. It only seems fitting during this year in which America turns 250. Unanswered questions, 250 years and counting, we're still waiting in America. Well, welcome back to the America at 250 podcast as we get ready for our third episode and a continuing interview with Joey Williams. And we'll get to that in just a second. But as you've heard in my opening episode, I'm really aiming with this at trying to cultivate a sense of empathy and compassion for other people, empathy and compassion that can actually lead to action. And so in that spirit, as we listen to this interview with Joey, there's a number of things to just be listening for. There'll be some mentions of tangible things that we can do. There'll be mentions, for example, of tangible ways to change what can sometimes be the performative nature of land acknowledgements. There'll also be some acknowledgments of the way that, for some of my more blue-oriented friends who may not want to hear this, the way that President Trump has actually done more for at least some indigenous tribes than Biden or Obama. We're going to hear about intertribal conflicts and how they're trying to navigate some of that sort of thing. We're going to hear about inherited advantages that the white majority actually has. For example, the economy of our country and the state of California, for those of us who live there, which really has benefited from the backs of enslaved peoples, from the taking of land from indigenous peoples, and has actually set the majority at a sort of very much advantaged position that we sometimes fail to take account of. We're going to hear about cultural resources and the issues that are involved in quote unquote ownership of things, for example, burial lands and the remains of people buried, places like that. And that's going to touch on a whole different relationship that we might have towards land and ownership, and a number of other issues that I really want us to be paying attention to. Things which, if we had learned them earlier, and things which we should have learned earlier, and still can learn from indigenous peoples, would have made and maybe still can make America great in ways that many of us still dream about. So, for example, different ways of handling political differences and allies and opponents. Listen for that. A different way of a more egalitarian approach to men and women in the roles of our societies, which is, of course, one of the fault lines of the Declaration of Independence that I've talked about. A different way of relating to the earth and our environment, which Joey will describe as our relatives, and how that could change America being great and how that's necessary for America to become great. And then we're going to talk about indigeneity, both for someone like Joey as a First Nations descendant, but also for all of us as human beings. What does it mean to become, again, indigenously human and thus humane? So a lot to listen for, but I don't want to prolong getting to the interview any further. So here we are, Joey and I together, having our second conversation. Thank you for joining us. All right. Well, welcome everybody to my second interview with Joey Williams. Really grateful to have you here. And just briefly, for people who might have missed the first one, just if you could introduce yourself again, Joey, that would be great.
Yeah, how to get Name Nugnagan Joey Williams, member of the Kern Valley Indian community and also president of the Coalition of California State Tribes.
Yeah, thank you. And we had a great conversation the first time. I'm going to be following up today more with kind of a, okay, what needs to happen as a result of some of the things that we covered? What needs to happen to make America great, but also just to be the right kind of people. And just for my listeners, one of my hopes in this whole series is really to try to encourage people to come at some of these issues from a point of view of seeking empathy and compassion, trying to put ourselves in the position of other people. And particularly as we deal with things that happened in the past, there are things still happening in the present, but as we deal with things that happened in the past, I often hear people, particularly in the white majority, say, well, it wasn't me, I wasn't alive then, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm trying to encourage everyone to put ourselves in the position of people who are descendants from things that have happened in the past, and to try to imagine what it's like to live in this country and experience America as it is. And so thank you for helping in that process, Joey. Today we're going to sort of talk, we're coming back to sort of two big things. They're what I call macro and micro. So there's the kind of macro things that deal with some of the things that Joey's involved in his roles, official roles. And then also the micro things, which are more kind of the attitudinal and maybe personal things that we need to pay attention to. And both examples of both have come up in our prior conversation. So starting with that first kind of higher level macro thing, I know one of the things, Joey, that the coalition works on is things like federal and state recognition. And so let's just talk about that for a little bit. Like what does that mean for our viewer audience who doesn't maybe know? And because a lot of people might assume, well, everybody's recognized, right? All the tribes are recognized. And but what's at stake in recognition and non-recognition, and kind of what's the status of that, particularly in California where you're working most directly?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that, but it's going back to the point you started with is that folks who may say it wasn't their ancestors that did it, they still have a generational benefit from what their ancestors did economically through the theft of lands and through chattel slavery, which economically built the government and the system that they've benefited from and the generational wealth that's taken place from there. So,
Yeah,
um,
that's
federal recognition is
culture.
something that, inherently tribes are sovereign through our creator and through the universe and through our relationship with the earth, that our ancestors are buried in the earth for time immemorial. That's our claim on inherent sovereignty. There is a thing in the now called United States called federal recognition. It's where the white man or the government, says that you're Indian. And ideally, those folks who are recognized since the 1970s were traditionally accepted that they were the ones who were complied easily with the U.S. government or
Mhm.
the Mexican government or the different forms of colonization. So it comes with a form of benefits, as wards of the United States, in a sense, is that the lands that they have, they don't have the title. Indeed, it's still owned by the U.S. government, but the land's in trust. So
Mhm.
they're able to have, rights over those lands to be able to do things like gaming, different things that wouldn't be able to happen over lands that weren't in federal trust and
Yeah.
federally recognized tribes. Also, that comes with, healthcare access and, certain economic things that help tribes. Now, there's not every tribe is fairly recognized. Those who resisted or were punished by not being fairly recognized, and those who there's a state recognition that 12 states have that recognize state tribes that are not fairly recognized. California is not one of those 12, though they have a Native American Heritage Commission list, which has been used as far as cultural resources and how city governments and county governments relate to tribes. It's not an official state recognition process. That's something that's still waiting to be done. And the Governor Newsom and Brown have both issued apologies around California Truth and Healing, but have not really laid any tangible
Mhm.
policy things out that are going to back up what their apologies did as far as
Yeah.
recognition, state recognition, healthcare access, and housing.
Well, and that actually sparks it's a related question, but it's very common these days for in California for a meeting to open or an event to open with the organizers who frequently are white. making some kind of acknowledgement. We acknowledge we're on the sacred lands of whatever tribe is in the area. And I've always wondered how that actually feels to someone like yourself.
Yeah. It's performative in the sense is that, it may make them feel good that they're acknowledging the lands, but they acknowledge lands that they have no intention of returning.
Yeah.
And I've made it a practice whenever we're asked to come do a land out acknowledgement or blessing, that I'm not doing it for any organization that's not pledging 1% of their collective budget to Black or Native organizations, or that are actively participating in the sovereignty and self-determination of Native American tribes.
Yeah.
So, and I've gotten a lot of people when I've said that who won't reach back out. They'll try to go an easier route,
Okay.
probably try to find more docile Indians that will do it without any pushback. And that's not who I am.
Yeah, thank you. So I mean, it sounds, and maybe this is a spot to just mention, are there ways that people can tangibly contribute to some of the
Oh,
things
yeah.
financially, but helping contribute to recognition process or that sort of thing? You mentioned giving to organizations. That's certainly there, and I want to
Yeah.
encourage listeners. But yeah, and yeah,
Yeah. There's ways they can. There's things called Acknowledge Rant. I know the Ohlone folks have it up in the Bay Area where people can volunteer to give a portion of their organizational personal budgets to the tribe. I know in San Fernando, the Fernandeños de Tavium have an Acknowledge Rent site on their website where people can go and donate parts of their budget, or, make a monthly contribution to the lands that they're living on. People do that. So, yeah,
okay,
I think I would really encourage folks think about doing that, because we're not the fourth largest economy in the world for nothing.
right.
These lands are indigenous lands and resources that we've caretaken for time immemorial,
Mhm.
and a lot of things that were built. There was a form of slavery here too. Slavery came over in Southern California at the end of the Civil War as well, and then also the institution of slavery in the mission system of
Yeah,
Native Americans, which goes highly unacknowledged.
right. And just for my listeners, I'm going to be talking about some of the mission system in some future um, interviews as well. But so just and Joey is, for example, the Coalition of California Tribes. Is that something that people could donate to if they're
Yeah, they
okay?
can, absolutely. I think if you go to our website,
Great.
www.ccstribes.org, there'll be a site there to donate. And also
Yeah.
folks can, yeah, just
And
email us at team@ccstribes.org if they would like to, just reach out directly.
I'll put all that in the episode descriptions as well for people. Thank you, Joey. Well, so recognition, obviously, a huge thing, a lot at stake. What's the status of that currently, say, in California? I know that originally there were, what, 190 um,
Yeah.
autonomous tribes before the colonization period. But what's the current status of recognition?
Well, the federal recognition process wasn't meant to be an easy process.
Mm,
There's only 18 tribes, I think, that have gone through the recognition process since 1978 and actually got recognized. And it's been like a couple decades of verifying records, baptismal records, birth certificates,
mm,
tracing it to a common ancestor. And then you get folks who will file petitions. And now with the emergence of gaming in the last 25, 26 years, got tribes that'll treat fairly recognized, non-very recognized tribes as competition and try to block that. And then you have
okay,
municipalities like LA and San Francisco, which will block like Ohlone and Gabrielino folks who are fighting, and Tataviam that are fighting for federal acknowledgement. So the process is different for every tribe because every tribe has to go through it. Now, like with the Great and Rancheria, the Miwok folks up, they were a group of tribes that were petitioning for federal recognition back in the 2000s with or late 90s with Senator Feinstein. And when she had made a clause in there that the tribes, if they got recognized, couldn't build casinos. And everyone was like, oh, okay, that's not a non-starter for us. We're going to pull out. Grayton went through and did their recognition. And then when it came time after they got recognized and went through Congress, the congressional route, they told Senator Feinstein, hey, we're sovereign now. We can do whatever we want. We don't have to uphold
yeah,
that. And, they did it. And I'm glad they did,
right.
because, how many broken treaties have there been? How many things have happened. And so now the process that there's congressional route. Most recently, we saw Donald Trump. A lot of people like to give Trump a lot of crap, but when we think about like native sovereignty, he's first administration and second been part of four tribes being federally recognized,
Okay.
and Obama and Biden were zero.
Okay.
So when
Well,
we think about it,
we
yeah,
want to give credit where credit is due.
yeah,
And I
broken clock is right twice a day. And most recently,
yeah,
the Lumbee folks who have been in a battle with the Cherokee Nation over getting their recognition for decades. They helped Trump deliver North Carolina, and he helped deliver their federal recognition. So
I remember
there,
that. Yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, it's going the Office of Federal Acknowledgement is not an easy one. Could take many decades. Could take several millions of dollars that tribes don't have to hire genealogists and academics
Right.
and consultants to be able to help do that. And,
Yeah.
I think some of the tribes are in the second phase of that and, waiting to move into the third phase. And a couple of tribes I know
Yeah.
personally. So every tribe that applies or petitions in a different spot. Not everyone's on the same level because it goes through the federal government. Of course, it depends on each administration, how much resources they have for the Office of Federal Acknowledgement. So it's not something they're actively doing, trying to get tribes recognized. It's a very long process.
Okay.
Most of the time, it's not what you know, it's who you know.
Right.
So,
Well, I think in one of our prior conversations, you mentioned that in terms of the tribes in California, that there may be like 80 that are still not
yeah,
recognized out of,
80 that are not recognized, 110 or so that are federally recognized. The most anywhere in the United States is 575 federally recognized tribes in the United States and Alaska. So, yeah, there's about 80, maybe 60 have active petitions or process
okay.
that they're trying to do, and everyone's on a different playing field.
Back. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So still, and a lot at stake, as you mentioned earlier, for that in terms
Yeah.
of people's welfare and well-being. So, yeah,
That's why we united the coalition, with our 10 members and our 30 affiliates is to help people in that process so we can share resources, share knowledge, and build
right.
collective power amongst our tribes to be able to push back on legislations that's going to harm federally recognized tribes or to help us through the state and federal recognition process or to get a state process.
Okay. Good. Thank you. So again, I'll put in the podcast description ways that people can be in connection with the coalition and perhaps contribute financially or perhaps in other ways. So thank you for that. I really
Mhm.
appreciate it. And then I know one of the things that we've talked about a couple of different times, and it came up in our first interview as well, is what might be called, in generic terms, cultural resources. And whether that's ancient burial grounds or some of the ceremonies, practices, et cetera. There's a lot, and I know there's been a history of stifling that. There's been a history of battles to gain possession of cultural resources, particularly burial grounds. So, like, if we could explore that a little bit, some of the things I know you've been involved with, and I know the coalition seems to get involved with at times. So,
Yeah, there's tribes that have worked with like local, like Santa Monica Conservancy, and they've enjoyed a relationship, a government to government relationship, whether it's federally recognized or not. And last year there was a bill by Senate Member Aguilar Curry that would have limited the rights over cultural resources and the to only federally recognized tribes. So tribes that are 100 miles away from non-recognized tribes, ancestral and current lands, would be making decisions over lands that were not theirs. And we organized many of our non-native allies, like 60 opposition letters, a few federally recognized tribes joined to come against that. That was actually led by Grayton and Pachanga, their lobbyists, the big gaming casinos, to
no.
block that so that folks would have access over their cultural resources and be made by fairly recognized tribe. And that there's a term going around called California Native American tribes, and they're seeking to make that definition to be only fairly recognized tribes or
Wow.
folks who are in petition. And that really limits the power of non-recognized tribes or their ancestral and their current land. So even though we pushed back and we defeated the bill and never made it to a committee, there's still grants and state agencies that are trying to push that term to mean only fairly recognized, and it's really dangerous and it's really insidious to do
Mm.
it because it's a collective effort to erase indigenous peoples, and it's actually coming from other folks who are lineal descendants of tribes. I say
I
lineal
see.
descendants because some folks may be 1/16th of we're the only people that have to prove our
Okay.
blood quantum like animals, like horses.
Mm.
But some people who may be 15th, 16th European and 1/16th,
Yeah.
Native American, who are trying to erase people like myself. And you can see myself, I'm indigenous, I'm indigenous from south of here and I'm indigenous from here.
Yeah.
But to erase people like me who are definitely indigenous lineal descendants.
Yeah. And talk about that erasure attempt a bit more, the kind of forms that takes, and
Yeah.
what, yeah, how you've
Yeah. So if
experienced
you
that. Yeah.
you already can see the erasure, like when the somebody remember Ramos, the only tribal member in the California legislature, when he has events at the Capitol, he'll set out flags for all the federally recognized tribes, but he won't set out flags for the non-recognized tribes of
Right.
their nations. And that right there is another form of erasure,
Erasure.
though.
Sure.
Yeah, that he's not recognizing the folks who are here, and that non federally recognized tribes can make the case to not allow non-federally recognized tribes access to grants or to state grants. There's been a lot of folks like Natural Resources who have made great efforts to extend it to non-recognized tribes and certain folks that do, but there's a big push and
Okay.
like temper tantrums that happen from the federally recognized tribes to make
Okay.
sure that none of those resources get to non-federally recognized tribes, or because a lot of non-federally recognized tribes have to operate under a 501(c)(3) because they don't have the government and
Yeah.
government status.
Yeah.
So they try to shortchange or limit it because they've came in as a 501(c)(3), but that's the only way they can do business and do taxes is under a 501(c)(3) or a 501(c)(4). So,
Yeah. I mean, it sounds, I'm going to fish for the right words here. It sounds a bit like when in sort of family systems, when a family has, say, an abusive elder, in this case, the equivalent of that
yeah.
would be the sort of white government, as an abusive elder, that people internalize that sometimes, and then it affects how they relate within the family. And it
Yeah.
feels like a bit of that is happening with this Ramos example you're giving of
Well, it's a form of
pre-
lateral violence.
preferencing of the
Yeah.
preferencing of the officially recognized.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
It's
it's
a lateral violence that happens within, and I want to get too much into that, but
yeah, yeah.
also it happens within tribes. There's a movie out called You're No Indian. It was
Mm,
produced by Wes Studi and Tantun Cardinal, and it talks about Chukchansi and Pachanga and their California tribes that have disenrolled members of their tribes. So they go back and they can disenroll ancestor from the 1800s, and that would knock out a whole lineage of
wow.
people if they were
Wow.
disenrolled. And that means that there's more per cap from the casino for a
Got
shorter,
it. Yeah,
smaller amount of members. So it's not just on the non-federal, it's within their people's own tribes, but at the same time, people are sovereign. To say whether it's right or wrong, I can't say that.
yeah. That's the
Obviously, there are
catch
some
22.
issues,
Yeah,
but sovereignty is exactly that. You get the right to make the rules over your own nation and to govern it. Like we talk about, like people talk about Iran, right? Like, oh, women don't have rights, so they gotta like this and that. But then here, you have someone like Hedsgeth, who's blocking women service members from promotions and this and that. So how could we call the kettle black when we have our own house cleaning we need to do?
yeah.
And
Removing women from websites and their histories from
yeah,
websites and
or canceling women's
color.
veterans celebrations last
Yeah,
week.
yeah,
That was, but then we want to talk about Iran mistreating their women and other folks. It's just how the narrative fits. And like, Iran is sovereign, and just like the U.S. government is claiming sovereignty over tribal lands.
yeah.
They get to make the rules for their how they govern.
Yeah. Well, let me just ask one kind of last question related to the cultural resources and the burial grounds. And I don't know why this is, as we've talked about it in the past, it just has really kind of tugged at my heart because I know you gave an example, for example, of I believe a university and the Catholic Church arguing over who owned it, but not talking to actually the tribe involved and that kind of thing. And I'm just trying to put myself again in the position of how that would feel if I were in the position of being a member of that tribe, to just sort of have my ancestors argued over, but not any say in it. And so I don't
Yeah.
really know what I'm asking, Joey. I kind of want that transparent in our conversation somehow, maybe for listeners, the issues involved with that.
Yeah, when you think about like there's some like 700,000 remains of our
Mm,
California tribal members or artifacts or
yeah,
human remains that universities have. I know even in my neck of the woods, Cal State Bakersfield has thousands of things they call collections that need to be returned under NAGPRA, Native American repatriation, to tribes. But under the federal act, it can only be done through a federally recognized tribe. So let's say they have ancestral remains of my people are not recognized. We have to go through like Bishop, Paiute tribe to where and they've been good about working with us to help
okay,
get those remains repatriated or rematriated back to the land, because there really was no ceremony we had.
right,
Burial grounds were never disturbed before colonization. So
right,
this is rather of a new process. And it'd be the equivalent of, somebody coming in and invading Washington, D.C., and then taking over Arlington Cemetery and starting to dig and build there and, removing remains and putting them in a museum. How would people feel about that?
right, right.
You know, and they'd
And
be
then
pretty
descendants
pissed.
coming and saying that's our grandfather or whatever, and then
Yeah.
saying, no, we own these bones. Yeah,
Yeah. Or
yeah,
these people don't matter because they were only here 250 years. So, we're
right,
here now. So,
yeah.
like they would be pretty pissed, I imagine.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and
Yeah.
understandably, right? So it's
Yeah, no different. We're very upset about that fact we have to do that, but then we have to go through all these processes to get our loved ones and repatriated, and also we have to fight like the Peabody and Harvard for artifacts that come from the island of Catalina, Pimu, that they've taken over the decades and can't get returned, and that there's a Native American Heritage Commission that has been no help to that.
mm,
Like
mm,
the most likely descendant is like it's not helpful. And trying to get those artifacts or remains back to where they need to be.
yeah, and the reason I kind of press into that is, again, one of my aims is I want listeners to feel, uh, be asking themselves, what would I feel if this was me? And
Yeah,
I think in our country, so often our disagreements and political conversations get distanced from real people,
yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah,
I'd love for them after they feel everything to do something to make
yes,
it right
absolutely,
because
yeah,
feelings are feelings. But I agree. I've been an organizer for 20 years. There's no nice way to make change.
yeah,
And sometimes you just gotta make it happen.
right,
Regardless of how people feel,
yep,
and because we like to think people are inherently want to do the right thing and have a moral compass. But I think the history of this country has shown that it's not true because
yeah,
you have people like John Brown who put
yep,
foot to ass and, like went out there and insurrected and got hung for treason for
yeah,
trying to free people who were enslaved, right? And being
yeah,
un-American because to be American means you own people.
right,
That was the values of
uh-huh,
chattel slavery is that they own people, human beings. And there's been countless others who have tried to fight against the system or chattel slavery or genocide and have been punished,
right,
for that. Even the Lakota, when they rose up against Custer, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and they have been punished since then. One of the poorest tribes.
right,
The Black Hills taken because they found gold, and the
uh-huh,
still continue to be punished because of the resistance they had against invading army, on their ancestral and their current lands.
yeah, absolutely. And my point here isn't to diminish any of that at all.
Oh
I hear you. I think in one avenue that I've seen in people is that I have seen people who are like opposed to whatever XYZ
yeah. Hmm.
until they actually put themselves in the position of like, oh, if that was me, and then they're more willing to act. But again, I do agree with that has to lead to action. It can't just be a performative, oh, that was terrible, now I feel sympathy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been studying some things in the Buddha lately, and Buddhist compassion is only complete if it leads to action. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, so I really appreciate that emphasis.
Yeah, and if we even think about like most people, claim, 75% of evangelicals and Catholics voted for Donald Trump, and 50% of women, white women, voted for Donald Trump, and most of them claim to be Christian. And the center of their religion was a indigenous Palestinian man who was unjustly convicted for going in, turning on tables, and whipping the shit out of people because of the injustice that was being levied by the religious establishment around sacrifices
Right.
and the fleecing of the people, no pun intended, and that
Yeah,
you know, they Jesus put himself on the radar and got himself executed by the Roman police, essentially the Praetorian Guard, and that's who people claim to follow. But knowing that this person is a dark-skinned body person who was taking action, behind their feeling to
yeah,
bring relief for their people and the oppression of European colonization by the Romans
yeah,
and trying to secure their indigeneity over their lands that they've been at for
yeah.
time immemorial as well. So I view Jesus as a very indigenous character.
Well, absolutely. And I think you're
Yeah.
pointing out some of the um, paradoxical, ironic inner contradictions of that are happening in white Christianity at the moment
Yeah.
in North America. And I say that as a white Jesus follower. I tend to refer to myself as a pre-Christian Jesus follower these days well, for a lot of reasons that are not the purpose of this podcast. But
Yeah.
yes, and I think the contradictions in all of that are lost on people are really actually profoundly disturbing. And so again, thank you for calling that out. And it's starting to pivot us to, I talked about the macro level things, and we've covered some of that. There's always going to be more to go into, and I want to encourage again listeners to check out the website for the coalition, and I'll put that um, in the notes for this episode, the podcast description. Um, but let's move more towards this kind of, I want to call it personal, not because it's just internal, but the kind of, um, some people may be thinking, okay, maybe I could contribute to that in somehow, in some way, but these things are so big, these issues are so big. I, I think there's a lot of value in trying to help people put some hangers on um, interpersonal things that they can do in their daily life, or attitudes they can cultivate, or ways of relating. One of those that I wanted to draw on, and I think it's brilliant, Joey, and I think it's brilliant in day to day relationships. I think it'd be a huge benefit if what I'm about to mention became more of the discourse in our national political environment and conflict. And that's this idea you mentioned in our last interview about no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, which can sound like a very, uh, just sort of pragmatic using of people. But actually, the more you've talked about it, it's really aligning around where you can find people to cooperate with and get things done and changed. And so maybe say a little bit more that I know it has a political application, but I think it can have so many different applications. But say a little bit more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been organizing for 20 years and community organizing. One of the organizing principles we've had is no permanent allies, no permanent opponents, only permanent interests. And our interests lie within our people.
Yeah.
And, we're working through this colonial system of government that there's times where, I've organized and we've said, for instance, like driver's license for people that they would call undocumented. I don't call them undocumented. I call them indigenous because
Hmm.
they've been here trading and intermarrying from Tenochtitlan, Mexico City to Utah for time immemorial. And now, they have governments making decisions on whether they could drive a car or not.
Right.
And ideally, there was a Republican senator and a state senator in Bakersfield, Andy Vidak, who was elected in a Democratic district. And he voted for children's health care and for undocumented license. But like on things like police brutality and different things that we wanted on the right to know and racial identity profiling act, he was against it.
Right.
So we know that we have him on this one issue around immigrants or indigenous people, but on policing. He's going to stick, to the state-sanctioned violence of the police force and stay there, hold his own there. So we know that it's a non-starter for us. But, and then we had a Democratic, he was supposed to be an ally in the assembly out of Kern, Rudy Salas, who opposed Proposition 47, which, funded schools over prisons, incarcerating black, brown, indigenous, poor white people. And then, he was opposed to the sanctuary, SB 54, that we helped co-sponsor. I was at a statewide faith-based organization. And we had to, when I was at Faith in the Valley, in Bakersfield, we had when I was a director there, we did a sit-in in his office with clergy and callers, and made the 5 o'clock news, and also started circulating at the Capitol that there were people protesting in a Democrat's office in Bakersfield, and he called the police on us.
Mm-hmm.
There's formerly incarcerated people there. He called the police on. So,
Mm-hmm.
with allies like that, we don't need opponents.
Yeah.
You know, so real quickly, the shame from his colleagues forced him to vote yes, but it also sent a message to our conservative folks in Kern County that we didn't have permanent friends or permanent enemies, that we were willing to turn up on whoever needed to be turned up on, whether it was because one of our own allies or not, for what we needed to get done. And there was a lot of performative action during the first Trump administration around immigration, around sanctuary, and we were actually providing real policy that was going to protect our families in real time.
Yeah.
So it was important. It was personal. It
Right.
wasn't business. It was personal.
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah. And what I appreciate and what I want to draw out here for listeners is that right now the climate and of political engagement is like, okay, like the party divisions, for example, is the
mhm.
tendency, and I don't just mean the people in office, I mean people who, register in Democrat or Republican, tend to, okay, my allies are the Republicans, my opponents are the Democrats. My allies are the Democrats, my opponents are the Republicans. My opponent is Donald Trump. Therefore, I can't agree with anything that he does. My opponent is Biden before that, so I can't agree with anything. It just feels like this climate is so opponent versus ally, as opposed to the approach you've taken at, partly just because of your expertise in organizing. It's not going to work that way, and you're
Yeah,
trying to get things done. So, but to be allies where we can be allies and opponents where we can be opponents, or where we have to be opponents, just seems like a more we can still engage with people then, right? Instead of just saying, oh, well, Joey and I don't agree on certain things, so he's my opponent. And now I have no opportunity to find where we could be allies. And
yeah.
yeah,
I feel like I've had more success organizing with conservatives, especially as a faith-based organizer
and
for many years.
you've said that. That's really
Yeah,
interesting. Hmm.
because we could always reach kind of a moral place, around values, Um, and I was meeting with a friend in the Bay Area this week, and we talked about the appearance of choice.
Hmm.
People think that the Democrats and Republicans that they're on two different sides when really they're part of the same government, two wings of the same bird. So when I tell you, Kevin, do you want a Diet Coke or do you want a regular Coke? Or now you can have Coke Zero.
Yeah,
Which one do you want?
right.
Yeah, but who's getting paid?
Yes.
Coca-Cola,
And
right?
ultimately, what's really the difference, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Coca-Cola gets paid either way, no matter what you choose, because it's one brand.
Mhm.
And that's what we have in the current political system is everyone says, oh, this Project 2025, it's a Republican thing. No, it's a Democrat and Republican agenda. This Powell memo that went out 40 years ago around how folks were organizing themselves in legislation. It was a concerted effort between Democrats and Republicans to consolidate power. And most people who are like the very staunch, we even see people like Marjorie Taylor Greene who have turned around over the last who there's this far, far right ideology that are walking it back, or that Congressman Thomas Macy, people who are defecting from that because there's very few people that are ideologues like the Trump. I don't even think Trump believes most of the stuff he talks
I
about.
mean,
Just knows,
that would be a big conversation. I
yeah,
agree with you. I agree with you.
he
Yeah.
plays up to his base because that's who he needs to play up to keep
Yeah.
power. And then on the other side, on the liberal side and progressive side, or whatever that means, progressive don't mean nothing in the hood. It's same thing. You'd have the Pelosi's and the AOC's and this and that, that they're not like, there's very few people that hold that kind of leftist ideology. If you took it at me, I'm probably left of the left. You think about my ideology.
Uh,
And I'm probably so left I come back around on the right, in full circle.
yeah. I'm so old, I'm back in style again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
real talk, because I grew up in the Central Valley. My parents were ministers, raised me. And
Yeah.
so, anyways, like and everyone else is in the middle,
Mhm.
this kind of independent. I've been independent for 12 years.
Yeah.
And like you have like 60, 70% of the rest of the people in the country or in the government and the United States and California that are in the middle. And
Yeah.
that's where most people are at. And that's really what, when we talk about hearts and minds, or we're talking about, trying to bend them, that's where the battle is at, is in those places for folks. Independents are the ones that decide everything. And California, the Democrats think they have power. It's not. It's the independents that have the power. Because you know how much mail I got from the government candidates during the election. You know how
Mm.
much I used to get when I was a Democrat? Zero.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they know that my vote as an independent is super important to how the election turns out.
Right.
And
So it's an indicator that, yeah, they know. Yeah. Well,
yeah,
as you know, so I'm going to move to another topic of this. We're kind of, as we explore this whole, the permanent allies versus permanent opponents. To me, that's one of the ways of trying to get where we can even have a possibility of America being great and
yeah,
operating great would be to come to some kind of a non-binary approach to these things where we're not looking at other people as just as opponents, but maybe opponents on certain issues and that kind of thing, or allies, but not, that doesn't mean we're going to support everything they do.
yeah. Let me share one last thing.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember back in 2014, we were running Prop 47, which classified low-level nonviolent felonies from felonies to misdemeanors, drug use, things like that. I got my felony reclassified in 2015 by the current public defenders. But when we were running the campaign, we joined forces with the current Taxpayers Association, and those are folks we wouldn't normally be in alliance with, and they saw it as, if people are out of prison and they're in society, that means they're paying taxes. That means it's going into the tax stream, and that's good for the economy and good for society. And me, on the other, I'm saying, hey, people need a second chance. At the time, I believed in second chances. I don't believe that anymore. I believe first chances. No one even had a first chance. And but they be able to get their life and have that and be able to thrive. So we're on two different tracks. We're trying to do the same thing, and we passed Prop 47 in California with 70% of the vote statewide. So
Mm,
that shows like how we joined forces with an unlikely ally, and we were
yeah,
able to come together in a bipartisan way and really get something done that brought people got released the night it was passed. People were
wow,
able to go to work and be off parole and go work in jobs out of counties. It was just
wow.
really like almost like what they would call in the Bible like a year of jubilee.
Right. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
first time I ever saw an actual election have immediate results,
Get results. Yeah.
and it was like 2014 when that happened. So I just want to
But
lift up that. I thought it was really important.
I appreciate it. And it's a tangible example of the benefit of the approach that we've just been talking about relative to allies and opponents. I think another thing that, in terms of what would make America great, that I think the conversations we've had might surface and have to offer, it goes back to, again, to some things earlier in this conversation, but also we were talking about, for example, the erasure of women and that sort of thing in the military. But even our first interview, and talking about the value of women in in indigenous peoples, and the matrilineal, matriarchal, the circle leadership, the more egalitarian kind of approach to those things, um, which is unfortunately getting really kind of rolled back in our country at this point, because it never had deep roots to begin with. But anyway, I'd like us to talk a bit more about that. You said some pretty significant things about that as we've talked. So, yeah, just
Yeah.
mhm,
Well, I think it goes back to how we're in right relationship as indigenous people with
mhm,
the earth and with nature, with our plant relatives, our animal relatives. And, I was just trying to make it to 18 growing up in the streets in the 90s in East Bakersfield, much
yeah,
less now talking like a tree hugger. It's the relationship and, the way us indigenous people value the earth as our mother. We would never harm our mother, we wouldn't ravish our mother. And then on the other hand, we have colonizers who came with the same system that was broken, didn't work in Europe, and implemented it here, where there's no regard for the mother, even their physical mother. Like their feel like colonial society is more likely to put their mom in a rest home where there's not those deep familial bonds, like Latino, indigenous, and even Black cultures where our mom and our dads are going to live with us till they pass away. You know, they're going to stay in the home in the family unit because that's how we care for our mothers. And I think that translates into how the matrilineal society was, is that women were primary in the society. Even choosing the leaders. I know in some tribes, the clan mothers chose who the chiefs were and who the leaders were. And if they weren't complying, then they were removed, and they could be removed by the clan mothers. And we think about, like with colonization, when they came to talk to the tribes, they wanted to talk to the man in charge. And, they
Yeah.
immediately pushed somebody out to talk there. Probably wasn't the leader or the brightest, but
Actual spokesperson. Yep.
they enjoyed that role and they never gave it up. And then
Mm.
they implemented a colonial form of government over these tribes. All these tribes have templates from the Bureau of Indian Affairs that tell them how to set up their government. I think there's only a few tribes like the Yurok who actually wrote their own constitution and bylaws up in Northern California. They're the largest in California. I think they have like 6,000 members. So, so a lot of things, but yeah, the societies ran different.
Yeah.
Where our mothers are counseling with the young men and women and grinding acorns, our staple,
Yeah.
which by the way, colonizers burn trees. And you look at Benjamin Madley's book, An American Genocide, you'll see that, they burned our food sources, ran out the deer and antelope, fish, dammed everything up. And then, we were going out to hunt and fish. And if we came back and we didn't have fish or we didn't hunt enough, that doesn't mean my family starves. It means the village doesn't eat.
Right.
So it's a collective thing. The burden is not on one person. And talk about childcare, the elders are teaching the children firsthand, watching the children and making sure they're learning the traditional ecological knowledge. They're learning astronomy, astrology, and all these different things that have been taught, for time immemorial. So very sophisticated systems, that were in place. And all this was, a lot of it was centered in a matrilineal society, and how we're tracing our lineages even to this day is through our mothers, because we knew that our moms were our moms, because they bore us, and that was the way that we proved that we were. Like my third grandfather, he was 16, I think, and my grandmother my third grandmother was like 30 something. So at the time it was real quiet and they didn't know, his son didn't know who his dad was, or my grandfather didn't know because, it was kept quiet because but you knew for a fact that you came through your mom,
Yeah.
your mom's your mom, and that's how you can make sure you trace your lineage. So,
Mm.
I could trace my lineage back at least 8 generations,
Mm.
to the early 1800s and those initial census rolls. And though through the foster care system, they try to show us that, hey, you don't have a family and you got to assimilate and, be adopted or, this and that. But no, that was all a lie to cover up the very sophisticated systems and things that we had as indigenous people that were working for thousands of years. But that can't work simultaneously for a colonial system to work and to be bought into economically. One's got to go, and the one side had
The
the
power.
violence and the weaponry to be able to force it
Mm.
on people. If it was so great, they wouldn't have to force it. Our societies that embraced it,
There's a great point
yeah,
there. And
yeah.
yeah, exactly. Well, so again, just to kind of tie that off, and this makes a nice segue to our next topic, but the one of the fault lines that we've identified throughout this podcast so far is women in among the framers of the Declaration of Independence. Women were not on equal footing, and that has persisted. One of the things that could make America great is returning to the kind of role of women that you're describing. And but you began to talk about that in connection with our mother, the earth, and the other elements of nature, et cetera. And so I want to talk about that a bit as well, because you've in our private conversations as well as previous conversation in the interview, this kind of symbiotic relationship with land, animals, water, air, et cetera. And of course, right now, climate concern is under vicious attack from the current administration. And um, man, if it just feels like there's food here that can provide sustenance for America becoming actually great, but I don't think we can do it if we don't face this mother, the earth and
Yeah.
that. So
I think I said at last interview is that we won't be great again until we stop being American and start being relatives. And I
yeah.
think that's how we got to be able to relate and care for each other on a larger level that goes beyond individualism, American exceptionalism, but
Mhm.
goes more back to indigenous ways of living. And I think about like the way that society is set up, for women, there's a pecking order, that,
Mhm.
ideally it was white Christian men, straight men who own property, which were people too. They own slaves.
Yeah.
They own proud African peoples who were forced into chattel slavery, and how they were given power, and how women were property too. And they were property to have a male heir to be able to pass property on to. So and that the relationship of whether they got the right to vote or even get credit cards in 1975 and own a home
Crazy.
was
Yeah.
all. I know my mom, Susan, who went to the army in the late 60s, faced a lot of crazy stuff there, that they there wasn't much for women and for like brown people to be able to do. Had to go to the army, became a nurse during the Vietnam conflict. So it's like, there's um like this pecking order, and then in turn, white women will, turn and peck on black people and,
Yeah.
oppress them and oppress indigenous people.
Mhm.
And not necessarily like fault, it's just kind of how colonization drizzles down, and so how even like the marriage system is like a contract that kind of it does fuel colonization in a current form. But I know like in our societies, you could have a kid and you wouldn't necessarily have a mother, father, but you're raised by the village,
Right.
aunties, uncles, grandparents, elders who raised you. And that's kind of the atmosphere I grew up in. And I'm really grateful for that because I was raised by community, and I didn't have the traditional mom and dad home that everyone says. And most people don't. I think only 25% of people have that traditional or whatever they call it, that propaganda about what a mom and dad home, what a normal home's like. And there's no such thing, it's
Yeah.
the fabrication. And the family
Stereotype.
unit is the family unit, which you got people that, whether they're blood or not, that love and care for you and are nourishing you and raising you in a way. So I think even the role of women, white women in society has been distorted, and they've been, you know and that there's a different way that we could go, where we could build different structures where that wouldn't be so anymore.
Well, I find it really, really interesting, just the thread of what you're sharing is I started talking about the matrilineal aspect and how that, returning to a different view of women could make America great, and that there's a lot to learn from the
Life givers, if
culture
they
that you're
choose to
describing.
be,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
life givers.
Yeah, and what exactly, and you segued from that into, our mother the earth, and then when I asked about Mother Earth, and you talked about relatives, you came back to our human relationships with women, and and that's really important because all those are interconnected. Our attitudes towards one affects the attitudes towards the other, and the way we have treated women is a mirror image of how we have treated the earth.
Yeah. And
Um,
how we treat ourselves, because as manly as we may look on the screens, the people can't see us,
Well, you
or that
maybe not
we
you,
may think we are one half our mother and one half our father. So if we're mistreating women, we're mistreating ourselves because we're
really good.
half our mother.
Yeah, really, really good point. And so again, just to kind of, I'm watching your time because I know you have a hard stop. Just to tie that off, I think this whole allies versus opponents,
Mhm.
matrilineal, recovering relationships, egalitarian relationships, men and women, all of that also affects how we view the earth, and how we view the earth and those resources affects how we view all these other things. It's really all interconnected. And I loved your phrase about, becoming, treating each other as relatives and not just humans, but the whole cosmic system. So, and so one last thing, and you've mentioned this as well, indigenous people, and I want to talk about indigenous for a bit. And uh, you've talked about it, of course, in relationship to your own people. You've talked about how important it is for you to be indigenous, and that's in itself a revolutionary act. So talk a little bit about that, and then I'll kind of begin to wrap us up. Yeah.
Yeah, I've said this is that the most revolutionary thing, most powerful thing I can do is be indigenous because
Mm,
so much was set in place to make me not be who I am. Going into foster care, 7 years old, kidnapped by the Kern County Sheriff's Department, getting my hair cut off, losing my language connection to my tribe, and taken from my great aunt, who was my caretaker, who was one of the last native speakers of our language. So much that happened to make me not be who I am. And lo and behold, 40 years later, I am tribal chairman in my tribe, vice chairman, and I'm president of a coalition, and I'm connecting to my indigenous ways of living and practices, and I know who I am. That's the
mm,
crazy thing about it is a lot of people are trying to assimilate this thing called being an American.
yeah.
They don't know what it means or exactly what it is. Does it mean that you bleed red, white, and blue, or you wave the flag and say some chants and things, and that makes you an American? But I know exactly who I am. I know who my ancestors are. I know where they're buried. I know their names. I know what they ate traditionally. I know the types of baskets we weaved. We were amazing basket weavers up in Tehachapi. You'll see them in the museum. Like I know all that, and there was so much that was engineered to make me forget it and try to be something else. And for me to reject all that and within my DNA, I always say there's generational trauma we have from colonization and genocide, but also there's thousands of years of solution and wisdom in our DNA from our ancestors that kept us. And that's really what kept me all these years is that the universe, the ancestral wisdom, and you got to have a bit of wanting it. You got to want to have it. And once you want that and you're seeking, the universe will create ways for you to find it. And that's what I've done is I've always followed the universe, whether the universe was called Yahweh or heaven,
Yeah.
or whether it's called Tukubiaf, my God that we call God in my Kwaizu language, or it's the spirit world. No matter what it was always there, and I was always able to tap into it because I was looking for it. So,
Well, and as I start to wrap us up here, I think I can imagine, this is just something I'm thinking out loud. I haven't thought this all the way through yet, but I think, there's so much emphasis, particularly among white Americans, on, patriotism and being American, et cetera. And I wonder if some of that is because we don't know, what it would mean to be indigenously who we are, because we've gotten all mixed up from Europe and all kinds of stuff. But so my challenge to my listeners who might be in that position of like, well, that, what does it mean to be indigenous? And, maybe they're substituting being an American for being indigenous, whatever that means, is, well, okay, but we're all human. And so I think for those who are struggling with, well, what would it mean for me to be indigenous? I think, okay, well, let's be human beings, um, and actually learn how to treat other human beings as human beings, and humanely, et cetera. And man, that seems like America would be greater if we could do that. And allowing other people who do know their indigenous roots to the freedom to truly be that, and to value and recognize and honor it, and not just be patronizing about it.
yeah. Well, regardless if America figures out how they want to be great or not,
Mm,
my people are a lot older than America
mhm,
and Turtle Island here. And, we will remain and we will be here for another way beyond 250 years, another 250,000 years. Our people will continue to be here. And, so to me, it doesn't matter if they figure it out or not, because it's not going to change much for us that are from here, that were indigenous.
Well, I think our conversations, this one and our prior interview, have shown that there's a lot we can learn from you, and I appreciate you sharing it with us, Joey. And
Thank you.
yeah, and so everyone, stay tuned for the next episode, my next interview partner, and I truly hope we'll engage in the journey of true empathy, compassion, but also action. And again, I'll put things in the podcast description. Hopefully, people will be able to continue to learn from you, Joey, and from the coalition and others that are doing this work. And I want to say thank you again.
Oh, you're welcome.
Hey, I just want to interject with a little bit of an outro here, which will serve as some segues to future episodes as well. You may have heard, and it was almost in passing, but Joey referred to the Peabody Institute at Harvard. And I just want to mention that because Harvard is going to come into the conversation again later when I talk with Tamara Lanier and her experiences with Harvard in trying to get back some pictures that were taken of her ancestors. As a descendant of an enslaved person, she had to do battle with Harvard. That's going to come back into play. But specifically, this mention of the Peabody Institute at Harvard it's one of the institutions that has been entrusted with following through on NAGPRA, which is basically the whole negotiation of repatriation, we might say, of artifacts of the buried loved ones and remains of loved ones and ancestors of First Nations peoples. This is something that happened all over America as various institutions took part in archaeological research. They dug up ancient burial sites and collected the remains and created exhibits and all sorts of things. And we're now in the process of a negotiation and renegotiation and a process whereby tribes can lay claim to these. But I just want to kind of identify the whole sort of hubris of this situation of first taking such remains from ancestral lands, which had already been taken away from people, taken away from burial sites, and then allowing academic access, digging up those remains, objectifying them as artifacts, installing a system that require people then to apply for the remains from an institution that laid claim to them and then kind of displayed them as exhibitions and all of that. But without any inclusion originally of conversation, of course, with indigenous peoples who had been removed to reservations away from these burial sites, and without any conversation about the issue of the land itself. So here are the remains, but the land is staying where the land is. It just raises a lot of questions, and it's something that I want us to be able to cultivate a sense of empathy and compassion for, put ourselves in that position, and see how we would feel about it and how that might change our attitude towards certain things. I had also mentioned indigeneity during the conversations that came up, and I'm suggesting, without any sense of diminishing the importance of people recovering their actual indigenous identities. But I did suggest that for those of us who can't really trace our indigenous roots anywhere, that recovering a sense of just being human beings, indigenously human, is really valuable. And towards that end, trying to imagine ourselves as descending from people who lived in, say, the southwest of the United States before Spain and Mexico in the United States, and then feel our way into what the whole conversation around borders and immigration and legal and illegal immigrants might feel. How does that feel if you are descended from people who lived here before any of those political states and borders were put in place? And I say that because that is the direction where my next guest is going to take us. So I hope you'll continue to join us. Maybe someday in America, another day in America, Maybe someday in America